He had survived 3 tours, 2 improvised explosive devices, and 1 winter in the Kandahar mountains that he never talked about. What broke him wasn't any of that. What broke him was coming home. The house in Gimli, Manitoba, still had Eleanor's garden boots by the back door. 14 months after the funeral, Marcus hadn't moved them. He told himself it was because he hadn't gotten around to it. He told himself a lot of things in those 14 months. Marcus Shea had retired from the Navy at 47 with a bad knee, a commendation he never framed, and the particular kind of silence that settles into a man when he realizes the noise he was running from was never the war. It was himself. He'd sold the house in Victoria where they'd lived together for 11 years, because every room had a version of Eleanor in it. Eleanor reading on the window bench, Eleanor burning toast on Sunday mornings, Eleanor standing in the kitchen doorway asking him why he couldn't just stay home this time. He couldn't answer that then. He still couldn't. Gimli was his mother's idea. Technically, she'd grown up there, on the western shore of Lake Winnipeg, and when she'd passed, she'd left him a property that sat on 3 acres of spruce and silence. Marcus had driven out in November with 2 duffel bags, and a box of books he never opened, and he'd told himself it was temporary. 14 months later, the only people who'd been inside were the propane delivery man and a teenager selling chocolate bars for a school trip who'd taken one look at Marcus's face and bolted before he could say no. He didn't miss people. That was the honest truth, or at least the version of it he'd gotten comfortable with. He missed Eleanor. He missed the sound of her feet on the hardwood at 6 in the morning, the particular way she said his name when she was trying not to laugh at him. He missed his dog, too, though he'd trained himself not to think about that. Shadow had been Eleanor's dog first, an 11-year-old lab mix who'd outlived her by 8 weeks, and then simply laid down by the garden boots one morning and didn't get up again. Marcus had buried him under the birch tree in Victoria before he left. He hadn't planted anything on the grave. He didn't trust himself with things that needed tending, the last thing Marcus Shea wanted. In that November that turned into December that turned into a second January alone was another dog. He found her on a Tuesday, and he'd driven into town for groceries. The real reason was that the internet had been down for 2 days, and he was starting to feel the particular cabin fever that even introverts can't reason their way out of. And on the way back, he'd taken the county road along the lake because the sky was doing something spectacular over the ice, that late afternoon purple that only happens in Manitoba in winter. And Marcus had always been a sucker for a sky like that, even when he pretended not to be. She was in the ditch beside the Garreau property, half buried in snow that had drifted against the fence post. He almost didn't see her. What made him stop was the way the snow moved, just slightly, just once, and some old training kicked in before his mind had caught up with his body, and he'd pulled the truck over and was walking toward her before he'd decided to. She was a Belgian Malinois. Or she had been, once. What she was now was a collection of bones in a thin coat, one ear flattened against the cold, dark eyes that tracked him coming across the ditch with an expression that was not quite fear, and not quite hope, but something exhausted in between. She was heavily pregnant. She shouldn't have been outside in this weather. She shouldn't have been anywhere near this alone. Marcus crouched in the snow 3 feet from her and said nothing for a long moment. The Malinois looked at him. The breath came in small white puffs. "Okay," he said finally. Just that. He wasn't sure who he was saying it to. He carried her to the truck with his coat wrapped around her and the groceries shoved to the floor, and he drove home faster than he'd driven anywhere in 14 months. Her name, he decided, was none of his business. He wasn't keeping her. He was going to warm her up, call the SPCA in the morning, and that would be the end of it. He found an old blanket in the hall closet and made a bed near the wood stove, and he heated up some broth from the freezer and let her smell it before he set it down. She drank carefully, with the dignity of an animal that had been well trained once and still remembered its manners even now. He sat across from her and watched her and didn't think about anything in particular. That was the most peaceful he'd felt in months. She had her puppies at 3:47 in the morning. Marcus was awake because he was almost always awake at 3:47 in the morning. That was just a fact of his life now, a body that had forgotten how to stay unconscious past the darkest hour. Heard the sounds from the front room and came down the stairs already knowing, somehow, and found her in the nest he'd made for her, working through it with a focus that was almost military. That he'd attended enough field situations to recognize a creature that had decided to be competent, in spite of everything. There were 4 of them. 3 made it. He sat on the floor with his back against the couch and watched it happen. He didn't talk. He didn't intervene unless she needed him to, and twice she did, and he helped without being asked, which was the only kind of help either of them seemed to be comfortable with. By the time the light started coming gray through the windows, there were 3 puppies nursing and 1 small burial to make in the frozen ground that he'd do later, and it was light enough. Named her Recon. He wasn't keeping her, but she needed a name. The puppies he called Birch, Frost, and Wednesday. Named Wednesday because she arrived last and sideways, and with an attitude about it that seemed to demand some kind of acknowledgement. He called the SPCA that morning. They were at capacity. They took his number and said they'd call when space opened up. They didn't call. Marcus told himself he was relieved because it simplified things. He did not examine that too closely. Recon recovered quickly. She was younger than he'd thought. Maybe 3 years old, maybe less. And whatever had happened to her before the ditch on the county road had left her thin and wary, but not fundamentally broken. She watched Marcus the way he'd once watched new recruits, assessing, reserving judgment, waiting to see what kind of person he actually was before she decided anything. It was the most honest scrutiny he'd experienced in years. He respected it. The puppies were another matter. Birch was the largest and the boldest, a sable and tan mix that had apparently decided on day 4 of his life that Marcus's boots were a territorial dispute worth having. He would drag himself across the blanket with enormous effort, plant himself against Marcus's foot, and chew with the focused intensity of someone making a very important political point. Marcus would look down at him. Birch would look up. Neither of them blinked. Marcus started putting the boots by the door when he was home, out of what he told himself was practicality. Frost was pale, creamy along the ears, darker at the saddle, and operated on what Marcus could only describe as a delay. Something would happen, and Frost would look at it, and then approximately 4 seconds later Frost would react to it. This gave him an air of either deep wisdom or mild confusion that Marcus found oddly comforting. And Frost was also the one who, at 3 weeks old, somehow located the single pair of Eleanor's reading glasses Marcus had kept in his coat pocket for 14 months and deposited them on Marcus's chest at 6 in the morning while he slept on the couch. Marcus sat up and held them for a long time. He didn't cry, he was out of practice, but something in his chest shifted like a door that had been stuck and then very slightly moved. Wednesday was the problem. Wednesday was small and black-masked and relentlessly, personally interested in Marcus in a way that the others weren't. The others treated him as a fact of their environment, like the wood stove or the food bowl. Wednesday treated him as a project, as she followed him from room to room, or tried to, still half falling over her own paws, and when he sat she would climb whatever was available to get closer to his face, and when he stood she would sit directly on his feet and look up at him with an expression that could only be described as concerned. She seemed to have decided that Marcus required supervision, and she was not going to subcontract the job. He told Recon about it one evening, sitting by the fire. "Your daughter," he said, "has no sense of personal space." Recon looked at him with mild interest and put her head back down on her paws. Marcus looked at Wednesday, who was sitting on his socks. "I don't need company," he told her. Wednesday put her chin on his ankle. He'd started talking to them by accident, which he recognized as the first sign that something was happening to him that he hadn't authorized. It started with operational commentary. He'd narrate what he was doing the way he used to narrate patrols, a habit from years of keeping his team oriented. Checking the woodpile. Winds picking up from the northwest. "We're fine." Then it became more conversational. Then one morning he caught himself telling Recon about the time Eleanor had tried to teach him to bake bread, and the entire loaf had come out with the density of a defensive weapon, and he'd laughed. actually laughed, the real kind, surprised out of him. Recon's tail thumped once against the floor. That was enough. He didn't call the SPCA again in February. He told himself he'd wait until spring. His brother-in-law called in early March. Eleanor's brother, Thomas, who was a decent man and tried not to hover but didn't always succeed. He asked how Marcus was doing, and Marcus said fine. And Thomas said the family was thinking about him, and Marcus said thanks, and they both understood that neither of them really had words for what had happened or what came after. Before Thomas hung up, he said, "You sound a little different, Mark." "I don't know. Better, maybe." Marcus looked at Wednesday sitting on the couch beside him. She'd learned to climb it 3 days ago and had not acknowledged this as a privilege but as a right, and said, "I got a dog. A few dogs, yeah?" "Long story." Eleanor would have loved that, Thomas said. There was a silence, and then he said, "Sorry. I don't know if that's—" "No," Marcus said. "She would have. You're right." He hung up and sat there for a while. Eleanor would have loved it, and she would have named them first, and asked questions later, and cried when the 4th puppy didn't make it, and cried again, when the 3 that did opened their eyes for the first time. She would have been right about dogs, the way she'd been right about most things. He'd known it and argued with her anyway, because that was the particular idiocy of men who were afraid of needing things. He wasn't going to be afraid of needing things anymore. He hadn't decided that exactly. It had just started to seem less necessary. The real trouble, the kind Marcus would think about later as the moment everything shifted, came on a Thursday in late March. The temperature had come up enough to make the lake ice unpredictable, and Marcus had been keeping the dogs in the yard during his morning check of the property line. He didn't have a fence yet. He'd been telling himself he'd put one in when the ground thawed. That Thursday, the ground was starting to thaw just enough to be deceptive, and he was pulling on his second boot when he realized the yard was quiet, in a way that wasn't right. Recon was there. Birch was there, digging industriously at something near the woodpile. Frost was sitting at the edge of the tree line with his 4-second delay expression, which meant something had happened and he was processing it. Wednesday was gone. Marcus found her tracks in the snow along the north edge of the property, heading toward the narrow creek that ran down to the lake. The creek had been frozen solid in January. It wasn't solid now. He followed the tracks at a controlled pace that was faster than running and had no name for it except the feeling in his chest that he recognized from the one time he'd lost a man and spent 6 hours knowing it before he knew it. He found her 150 meters from the house, at the point where the creek bank was undermined by the melt and the ice had gone thin and gray. She had gone out onto it. How far was anyone's guess, but far enough, and then she'd understood the problem, and she was standing very still in the middle of a situation she'd gotten herself into with full confidence and now needed help with. She looked at him when he appeared on the bank. He looked at her. "Don't move," he said. Wednesday, to her credit, did not move. Getting her off required 35 minutes, a length of rope from the shed, lying flat on the bank to distribute his weight, and a patience that Marcus had not known he had available to him anymore. He'd thought patience was something you had when you had hope, and he'd been running low on hope for a while. Apparently it had been there anyway, stored somewhere he couldn't access until someone small and black-masked needed it, and he finally got his hands around her. She was wet through and trembling and furious about the trembling. He sat back on the solid ground with her wrapped in his coat, and he held her tighter than he'd held anything in 14 months, and she smelled like creek water and mud and something warm underneath that was just dog, and she wiggled against his chest and craned her neck to lick his jaw with the enthusiasm of someone who had been only briefly inconvenienced. Marcus laughed again, the second real laugh. It surprised him less this time. "You are going to give me gray hair," he told her. She put her paw on his face. He carried her home. Recon met them at the door with the expression of a mother who had known exactly what had happened and had opinions about it. Birch sniffed Wednesday with great interest. Frost looked at her, waited 4 seconds, and then wagged. Marcus set Wednesday down and watched her shake herself off with enormous dignity and proceed directly to the food bowl as though none of it had happened. He put the kettle on, He stood in his kitchen and listened to the sounds of 4 dogs in his house. Paws on hardwood, the small communal sounds of animals settling, Birch dragging something that shouldn't be dragged. And he thought about Eleanor's boots by the back door and how he'd been afraid to move them because moving them meant something had ended. He went to the back door. He picked up the boots. He set them on the shelf in the closet. Carefully, the way you'd set down something you were done carrying but weren't ready to be rid of. Then he went back to the kitchen and watched the kettle and thought that the house didn't feel empty anymore. It didn't feel full the way it had with Eleanor. It felt like something else, not replacement. Nothing as simple or as insulting as that. It felt like continuation. Like the chapter after the one you thought was the last. He didn't know. That March afternoon, that recon would be with him for 11 years. He didn't know that Birch would turn out to have the most inconveniently good nose Marcus had ever encountered in any creature, animal or human, and that this would come to matter the following winter, when old Art Vaillancourt from the Garreau property went missing in a blizzard, and Birch found him 3 kilometers from his truck. Cold and bewildered and alive. He didn't know that Frost's permanent, contemplative expression would become locally famous in Gimli, or that Wednesday would spend the next decade as his shadow, as his argument against isolation, as the creature who had decided he was a project, and never rescinded the assignment. He didn't know any of that yet. He just knew the kettle was boiling, and the dogs were home, and the boots were on the shelf, and something in the room had changed quality. The way light changes quality in April, when the winter is technically over, but you're only just starting to believe it. Marcus poured his tea and sat down at the kitchen table for the first time in 14 months without turning, so that his back was to the window. He sat facing the door, the way you sit when you're expecting someone, the way you sit when you're not afraid of what might come through it. Wednesday climbed into his lap, settled herself with 3 rotations and a sigh of profound satisfaction, and went to sleep. Marcus put his hand on her back and felt her breathe. Outside, the lake was starting to melt at the edges. The birches were still bare, but there was something in them. Some preparatory tightening, some private decision being made that the branches hadn't announced yet. Spring, in Manitoba, doesn't arrive so much as it accumulates quietly in the margins, until one morning you look out and realize it has already happened, and you just hadn't been paying the right kind of attention. That was the thing about grief, Marcus would think later. Not that it ended, but it accumulated something alongside it. So slowly you couldn't see it until you looked back, until you measured the distance between the man who had left Eleanor's boots by the door and the man who was sitting at a kitchen table in the returning light, with a sleeping dog on his lap and the windows facing south. He hadn't gone looking for this. He'd been in a ditch on the county road, and he'd seen something move in the snow, and every good thing that followed had started there, in that one moment of paying attention, when everything in him had said there was nothing left worth watching for. He sat there until Wednesday woke up, and then he fed them all, and then he went out to look at the lake.